Okay, it is time to get started here. Blazecast for Wednesday afternoon. And you know we've been doing some of our Friday free-for-all Blazecast. We're going to particularly try to make this one focused on one particular topic, and that topic is going to be the new book, The Communist, by Paul Kengor. And he is going to join us here in just 1 second. We've done a bunch of preliminary pieces on this. You may have heard pieces with him with Glenn on the radio today. He was on with Sean Hannity yesterday. But this is also your chance to interact. And so right before I bring him in, I'm just going to give you some of the housekeeping so that you're aware of how everything works. You're able to chat and talk with each other. To do that, there's a little button on the top right of the window that lets you kind of access and pop out the chat window. On the bottom right of the player, there's comments and questions. And if you have a question, and that's not for really chatting, it's for really sending a specific question to me that you would like me to answer, and I can even put those right onto the screen so we can kind of see them and address them. I'm going to try to get to as many of them as I can. So right now I'm going to bring in Paul, and we'll also have Tiffany Gabay joining us. She's written a number of the pieces that we've had on the book, but Paul's joining us. You're all wired up there in the Dallas office, Paul?
I'm all wired up, Scott, ready to go.
Excellent. We'll also count on the audience to give us a little feedback sometimes on audio levels and all of that, and I'll keep an eye on it. So let me go right into this. The book has been out all of what, 24 hours. Before we get into details, I want reaction. What are you hearing from people that have already picked up a copy? Are you making anybody angry?
Well, no, not yet. But I'm sure that once it continues to sell and word gets out there to people on the left, it will make people on the left angry. You know, conservatives predictably like it, and and I would tell people on the left, I would encourage them to, practice what they preach and be open-minded, be tolerant, and actually read this with an open mind. They'll see that I don't call Obama a communist. I don't accuse Obama of all kinds of scandalous accusations, and I wrote, as they'll see, Tiffany can attest, I wrote a Cold War book. I mean, it's a book about Obama's mentor, who was in fact a literal card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And Scott, there were a lot of people in the 20th century, well, not a lot, but there were a lot of Americans who were like small c communists, right? They believed in the ideology, but to actually go and join the party, that's a big step. It's a big step.
And Paul, if I can pause 1 second, I'm going to ask you to make a tiny step. I think we showed you your mic level is a little hot, so if we can just kind of tweak that down a minor little bit, or have one of the guys nearby, that will help. But we're hearing you loud and clear. And this distinction, and I think by kind of obviously picking as the title of the book, The Communist, that really does kind of focus you in on who was this guy. And then obviously the key question is, there may have been a number of people that were card-carrying communists. Not that many were very, very close and for a long period of time to a future president of the United States.
That's exactly right. And I mean, Obama is the product of several influences. You've got his mother, of course, his grandfather, his grandmother. His father, Dinesh D'Souza, wrote his book, The Roots of Obama's Rage, about the father's influence. Some people have already asked me, Scott, well, I kind of thought Jeremiah Wright was maybe a mentor to Obama, and I think he probably was, but this all comes at different points in time. You've got the parental influence there in the 1960s. Obama was born in August of 1961. You have Jeremiah Wright, who comes in Chicago in the 1980s. But in between there, you've got those formative years of the 1970s, from the time Obama is 9 years old till he goes off to college, his adolescence, his teen years. And
it really is
it's
a pivotal time in the life of any young man, and looking and seeing what it means to be a man, and particularly somebody like Obama, who had actual father and father figures who were less than reliable necessarily in his life. Part of the
well, can I give you an example on that too?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Well, consider, for example, in the past I've done biographies of people as diverse as Ronald Reagan and Hillary Clinton, okay? And Ronald Reagan's mentor at that exact same period of time was a pastor named Ben Cleaver. Hillary Clinton's mentor was a pastor named Don Jones. So everybody has mentors, and now here all of a sudden we're gonna. You start with the mentors, and to think that suddenly now we're going to ignore this man who clearly had a strong influence on Obama. And by the way, Scott, Reagan in his memoirs doesn't mention Ben Cleaver even one time, but no one doubts that Ben Cleaver was a mentor. Obama mentions Frank 22 times.
22 times. When you look at that point of introduction, Frank Marshall Davis didn't like happen into Obama's life. When you look at the orientation of Obama's parents, of his grandparents, these were people that had radical orientations themselves. When we look at pictures of his grandparents, and they kind of seem sort of they have from the appearance, it kind of looks like, oh, that could be my grandparents, kind of sort of the middle American look. But not middle American in their values right from the beginning.
Right. In fact, to give you an indication of just how far to the left Stanley Dunham, Obama's grandfather, was, I mean, he picked as a potential father figure role model for his grandson, he picked Frank Marshall Davis. Right. And I mean, exactly. I was telling Glenn on the air this morning, Glenn and Stu and Pat, we have kids, and if we wanted to pick a mentor for our son or grandson, I mean, we might pick a little league coach, we might pick a Boy Scout troop master. None of us would pick a card-carrying member of the Communist Party called to testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee for his Soviet activities. But that gives you an idea of just how radical Obama's grandfather was, and he's the guy that picked Frank to be a role model.
Yeah, and not just, we'll get to address some of the issues surrounding this, but it's not just that he was a card-carrying communist. He was a pretty odd guy, right? I mean, I think probably anybody that spent any time around him realized that he's not like the junior member at the Rotary.
No, he was. He stood out, very unusual. I mean, there's all kinds of scandalous accusations about the guy. Right. Sexual stuff. Joel Gilbert did a film, right. A documentary looking into some of that. I avoid that. I deal strictly with the ideology, right. But wherever he went, he was unusual.
And let me get let me ask you about that, because I know Glenn had asked you about that on the radio today, but so we have that in here. Maybe people can ask questions. I'll remind them that if you click the comment or question box to the on the bottom of the player, that will put a question in queue. Try to make these very specific questions to the topic. I can't directly respond to you in the middle of doing this privately. So the questions you put there, I'll be able to drag into the player just to kind of make that connection. But when you decided, I'm going to avoid some of these other particular things about Frank Marshall Davis's life, that we've heard. Not even the stuff that's really that in question. They seem to like to take, erotic pictures. He wrote erotic fiction. Does that matter at all in sort of understanding this mentor, and why did you decide to leave that part out?
Well, I stuck with what I know, and the way that I came into this project, Scott, was I was doing Cold War research. I had done a book called Dupes. That was my last book, and that looked at archival research from the Communist Party, the Soviet Comintern, and in that book I had a couple chapters on Frank Marshall Davis. So I was going to do a follow-up to Dupes, and everybody had said, the most interesting thing about that book, Dupes, the most striking contemporary relevance is the stuff you have in Frank Marshall Davis. And so I continued to look for material on Davis, and I found it. And as I found that material, I said, well, this is it. This is what I got to write. But it was there that I stuck to his columns, right? I said, I'm a Cold War historian. I know about the communist movement, and I would read through the Chicago Star, which was the Communist Party USA publication in Chicago that Frank Marshall Davis was the editor-in-chief, founding editor-in-chief. And just by reading these things, Scott, and Davis's own biographer, a man named Tidwell, he was an expert on literary poetry and so forth. He would miss things. He clearly missed things that I got.
I think it just froze there. I'm not sure if you're seeing it on your end. I think we have one, John Seidel, Blaze Writer, is with Paul, and maybe we just need to refresh that screen down and down. Okay. He should be back up. in just a second. I think there is. And so I put a question on the screen, Paul. I don't know if you can see it, from Frank, who says, I'm trying to figure out if President Obama is a communist, a socialist, or a Marxist. And you've been pretty clear that you're not calling President Obama a communist.
No, I've stayed away from that. I mean, my goal here, and really,
I'm not hearing Paul at this second. If you could maybe refresh one more time for me, just do a page refresh and it'll come back up. I would say one of the things as we, and usually that fixes things when we've had any audio problems, just refreshing the page has kind of solved that issue. And so we may be able to get that to happen. Let me, and here's, oh, you can all hear him, but I can't hear him, as I'm telling John Seidel. So that hinders a little bit of the process. Now, I can try to refresh my page, and maybe that'll work. One of the things we've enjoyed about doing these Blazecasts, we've been doing them on Fridays, is you guys in the audience have been helping us figure things out as we go along. I'm going to refresh mine, so just pause 5 seconds. There we go. Let me do this, see if this works. All right, now if I do that and I pull Paul right back in, it'll be amazing how quickly this works, and we'll see if we get totally back on track. Paul, are you able to hear me now?
I can hear you fine. Yeah.
Perfect, and now I can hear you. So it's just I just had to kind of whack the computer on the side one time real hard, and we're back in business. So this question that Frank has about trying to figure out if President Obama is a communist, a socialist, or a Marxist. You've said you're not calling him a communist. What do you call President Obama?
I'm comfortable saying that this man's generally to the left of any president that any of us has had in any of our memories. And I mean, I don't want to be. I'm an academic. I write about this stuff. I could be real nitpicky in defining what's a communist, what's a socialist, what's a Marxist, what's a Maoist. So I don't want to get into that splitting of hairs. But what I see from the influence of Frank Marshall Davis is somebody who influenced Obama and helped make Obama a man of the far left. And I would say, and in the book I do go into this. I interviewed at length a man named John Drew, and John Drew, who's today Dr. John Drew. He knew Obama at Occidental College.
I've interviewed John as well a few years ago, and a real interesting guy. I mean, he was really paying attention at the time.
And totally sincere, totally genuine. And John Drew met Obama at Occidental as a fellow Marxist. Obama was introduced to him as one of us. Now,
and Drew was a Marxist at the time. He's not Marxist now.
That's right, and he's got no axe to grind. He's not a mean, nasty guy. He's not writing a book or anything like that. But if that's the case, then Frank Marshall Davis would help explain that. And here you have also Obama joined, as Stanley Kurtz has shown, this new party in the mid-1990s, which was basically a socialist, Western European socialist model type political party.
I think that's a very good point, because I think it's hard for anyone to deny now that Obama was sort of a member of that party, which was sort of self-declared as a socialist party. I mean, they were created, I think they were created when Jesse Jackson's presidential campaign kind of wound down. Some of the activists wanted a way to push the liberal Democratic Party radically to the left, and that's why they created that new party.
Well, and an interesting parallel here, Scott, is that Frank Marshall Davis, when he left the Communist Party, Frank Marshall Davis actually started running for local precinct elections for the Democratic Party. So he did what a lot of people on the far left did. They said, look, the Communist Party is not viable. We're not going to win in the United States. So I'm going to go into the mainstream Democratic Party. And in a sense, that might be what Obama did. I mean, Obama could have been on the Marxist left, say at Occidental in 1980. He ends up on a sort of socialist left with the new party in the 1990s. And then he eventually goes mainstream in the Democratic Party. And in all of this changes the Democratic Party from the party of Harry Truman and JFK to the party of Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama. So in that sense, I think all of this is very clearly relevant. And yeah, sure.
In order to get to as many questions from folks that are tuning in, and we have a large number that have joined us for this Blazecast here on Wednesday afternoon, we thank you for that. Rather than kind of go sort of chronologically through this story, I'm going to try to hit as many of the key questions here, and we'll kind of fit in pieces. But Jason asking, how much information were you able to learn about Vernon Jarrett, Valerie Jarrett's father, and the Chicago part of this story? Of Frank Marshall Davis and his sort of ongoing influence on Obama becomes important, doesn't it?
Sure. Yeah, Jason, that's a great question. In fact, I've got a chapter called The Chicago Crew. And in fact, I've got 3 or 4 chapters on the Chicago period. And Frank Marshall Davis, this is an amazing thing to think about. This is truly amazing. But Frank Marshall Davis actually worked in communist front groups, communist-controlled influence unions, and so forth. He actually worked with Vernon Jarrett, who was Valerie Jarrett's father-in-law. Valerie Jarrett, of course, is Obama's right-hand person, right-hand woman. And he also worked with Robert R. Taylor, who was Valerie Jarrett's grandfather. So Obama's mentor actually worked with 2 people associated with Valerie Jarrett. And get this, Obama also worked, even taught at the Abraham Lincoln School, which was a communist school in Chicago. He also worked with the Cantors, Harry and David Cantor. And Harry and David Cantor, the Cantor family, they mentored David Axelrod. So the current troika is essentially that's running America. Obama and Valerie Jarrett and David Axelrod, they all had common mentors. The Cantors, Frank Marshall Davis, Robert R. Taylor, and Vernon Jarrett, who all worked together in Chicago Communist Party circles in the 1940s. It's an amazing thing, and I assure you, it's absolutely true, as I detail very, very carefully with government documents, congressional reports.
And in that lineage, when you look at the parents, grandparents, in-laws of Valerie Jarrett, Axelrod, others, there's even relations with the parents of Bill Ayers, and his father was very influential in Chicago. Yeah, there's quite a genealogy there.
Right, and if I could give a nod to Trevor Loudon, a tireless researcher, right. He found one of the original committee reports, or there was a union, the Meat Packers Union, that they all worked together in, and Trevor Loudon actually found the letterhead, listing Frank Marshall Davis with some of these figures, with Vernon Jarrett specifically. So, if you can find these documents, which we did from the 1940s, they're all there.
And I'm putting these on in a couple of ways. Carol asking a tough question here, saying that she felt you gave a slightly different answer about how you came to Frank Marshall Davis's name, how you described that to Hannity, to how you described that to Glenn. I'm sure there were a number of factors, but is there anything we need to kind of sort through there about how this project came to be?
Sure. Yeah, I believe I was consistent on that. I said to both Glenn and to Sean Hannity that I was doing this research. I was doing research on dupes and a follow-up to dupes, right. And the dupes book came out in 2010. I started doing the research for that 2007, 2008 maybe. But I was listening to talk radio, and I can't remember exactly who it was. It might have been Sean Hannity, or it might have also been, Scott, you and I know Jim Quinn from right. Pittsburgh. And it was one of the two of them. I can't remember which. And they had mentioned Frank Marshall Davis as right. being a quote-unquote communist mentor to Barack Obama. And I thought, come on, this is, be careful here about tossing around the word communist. Conservatives have a tendency to be very sloppy about that. And I warn my fellow conservatives, when you do that, and the real McCoy finally comes along, right. You're not going to have a lot of credibility. Yeah, you do that. So anyway, I looked, I turned my head about 4 inches to my left, and I've got my committee reports sitting right there. I mean, my office has all these different, House Committee on American Activity report from 1944, Senate Judiciary reports 1957, and I looked in the index, and I looked under Davis, and voila, there he was. And so, I knew right then and there that I was dealing with somebody so serious that the government had its eye on him beginning in the mid-1940s.
Right. For those of you just joining us, you're watching a Blazecast, a live webcast here on Wednesday afternoon, talking with Paul Kengor, the author of The Communist. Paul is in our Dallas offices right now, getting ready to go on with Glenn on Glenn's program tonight on what was GBTV, becoming Blaze TV. He was talking about a Pittsburgh radio station because he's a professor in Western Pennsylvania, Grove City, and I bounce between Blaze offices in New York and Pittsburgh, where I am today. And I remember I was a guest on Glenn's TV show on Fox. It would have been probably about 3 years ago, exactly, just about this month. And I did a chalkboard where I did pictures of that Chicago genealogy of the influence on Obama. And Frank Marshall Davis was one of the pictures that we had on that board. And so I remember even thinking about it, pretty deeply back in that 2008, 2009 timeframe. The one question that we have here on the screen from Mikkel is, when you say mentor, to the extent, even with the 22 mentions, do we know to what extent that Frank Marshall Davis may have influenced Obama's thinking, and at what point did he exit Obama's life?
That's a good question. How do you define mentor? And in the book, I actually quote Merriam-Webster and Oxford, both defining the word mentor, and they call it something to the effect of a trusted or valued advisor, counselor, someone who gives guidance. And clearly, by that definition alone, Frank Marshall Davis is a mentor. I mean, he certainly helped give Obama guidance, no question about that. And there's all kinds of forms of mentorship. Bill Clinton, for example, lists William Fulbright as his mentor. And I know the Clinton interned for Fulbright, but I don't know if he ever met him. If he met him, it might have been during a lunch or something like that. But I can't picture. According to David Marinis, who just released the book on Obama, and the source for this, I believe, must be Obama himself. It must be an Obama interview with Marinis. Marinis says that Obama met with Frank up to 15 times. And if Obama told him that, I would expect Obama to actually underestimate the total because, I mean, in Obama's book, he conceals Frank Marshall Davis's full name. 15 times, and these guys would meet until late evenings together, long sessions, 4 or 5 hours, drinking together. That's quite a bit. I mean, I got people I consider mentors who I never met, nearly that much. So I mean, that's pretty good influence.
I had, I was thinking of it right when you said that is Obama would have every reason to kind of, or those around him to underplay that. I think back to when I was in high school, and there was a Christian philosopher named Francis Schaeffer who was very influential on my life, and I had the opportunity to see him 4 or 5 times and have some extended meetings and conversations, and he gave me very particular advice that was very helpful to me. And so I certainly would have said, I would consider him to have been, a mentor kind of influence. But it was nothing nearly as deep or ongoing over the period of years that Obama had with Frank Marshall Davis. The question we have here from Ellen is there any direct connection between Frank Marshall Davis and Jeremiah Wright? Obviously, both end up in Chicago, but I think they came from sort of different directions. Did they ever intersect either in direct connection or ideologically?
As far as I know, they did not, but they would have gotten along quite well.
Yeah, I think that's it.
They both had, let's say, an unexceptional view of America. And in fact, we thought about titling this book originally Frank Marshall Davis in the American Way, because Davis, one of the most consistent themes I saw in all of his writings was he relentlessly bashed the American way. And if you go to Dreams from My Father, Obama's memoirs, one of the longer quotations of Davis by Obama is this diatribe from Davis, is sort of parting advice to Obama before Obama leaves Hawaii to Occidental, where he's ripping, quote, the American way and all that blank. Right. So they would have, I think the Reverend Wright and Frank would have gotten along pretty well.
Now, you mentioned the parts of Marinis's book that mention this. I can't remember about the Resnick book. But largely, I think it's fair to say the national media has not really looked into much of Obama's, or at least fact-checked much of his past. Do you expect any coverage of this book, or is it in sort of the national media, or do you think that they're going to sort of diligently say, we'd rather not know?
I expect them to completely ignore me, to completely ignore the book, and unless I have some facts wrong, and then I'll hear from them. But
Right,
when you put out a book like this and you've got your facts right, then the liberal media avoids you like the plague. I told Glenn this morning about a document I published a few years ago on Ted Kennedy reaching out to the KGB against Ronald Reagan in May 1983. Stunning May 14th, 1983 document. Yeah. And I still, Scott, I still carry that document in my briefcase with me. I thought that I'd be answering for that for the rest of my life. I never got one single call from anybody in the media even challenging me.
That's amazing.
It's just extraordinary. The media bias is incredible, and only through things like the Blaze and these other sources can you circumvent all of this and have some, mercifully some alternative media.
Well, we're taking it directly to folks, and as you've seen, I've put up questions that are they're not softballs. We addressed early on that you did not make the focus of this book some of the things about Frank Marshall Davis's personal life, about the whether he took like to take nude pictures or write erotic fiction, even about young African American males and all the stuff that's been out there. Mark is asking the question. There are people out there who have been saying Frank Marshall Davis could really be Obama's father. I've seen there's another argument out there that really hit Obama's grandfather, Stanley Dunham, was his real father. I've even seen people say that Malcolm X was Obama's father.
Sure.
When you were going through all of this, I'm sure you knew you could probably sell a few more copies of this book if you kind of went down that path. So was there a point where you just kind of said, where you were tempted to at least address those issues?
Yeah, that's thank you for asking that, because you're right. I mean, if I wanted to, I could have put that in there. I could have put pictures in there. And you've seen some of these pictures that have been going around the internet for 3 or 4 years. Right. And I could have at least just speculated on it, and that alone would have Kengor talks about this in his book, that would have made people buy it. Right. But I said, look, I don't know this. I didn't look at this, and I did, Scott, a number of times. I said, okay, here's the date that Obama's father met Obama's mother. Right. Here's when Obama was born. I mean, you can't help looking at this, because these things are constantly in your mind, and you can't just close your mind off to them. But I said, I'm staying away from that. I'm going to stick to the ideology and Cold War history that I know, and that's it.
I brought in Tiffany Gabay from our DC. She's actually usually in our New York office, and she's in our sort of unofficial DC headquarters today. And she has, I'm coming from this having known a lot about Frank Marshall Davis and read a lot of the pre-material on your book, but having not had the chance to go all the way through it. Tiffany was the one who wrote the 3 in-depth pieces that we did on the Blaze before yesterday's publication date. So I wanted to bring Tiffany in here to kind of see what I'm missing here and what we need to go through. And Tiffany, when you when we were first talking about reading the book, give me your sense of what you thought about Frank Marshall Davis going in, and how radically did that change your view coming out the other side of the book?
Okay. Well, I've kind of always had these feelings about Obama and the circle that he came from, both of his parents, Frank Marshall Davis, Bill Ayers. But one of the things that really struck me about the book was how fair Paul really was. I mean, there are times in which he really paints Frank Marshall Davis as an even sympathetic character. This is a person who endured racism and, really some hardships growing up. So it wasn't just that he was painted as some, horrible person. There was a method to Frank Marshall Davis's madness. And one of the things that I was really taken by in the book, and this is something that people who've studied communism or the Cold War to a certain degree know, was the tactics of the Soviet Union, the propaganda campaigns among America's intelligentsia, and how, just how easily duped they truly were. So this was not uncommon for the time, but what I think was really interesting about Frank Marshall Davis compared to other, maybe small c communists of the time was that they were even willing to support Hitler. I mean, could you talk a little bit about that, Paul? Because that was one of the most, outrageous moments in the book to me, was just how devout and blindly Frank Marshall Davis followed the Communist Party and just basically towed the line.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Tiffany. And that's why I'll tell people, look, I'm not going into some of the sexual things, but the ideology alone is frightening enough. And in fact, it's the ideology that killed over 100 million people in the 20th century. So, I mean, the communism in and of itself is what's so disturbing. But Frank Marshall Davis originally was drawn to the party, well, in a couple ways. One was the Scottsboro campaign in the 1930s. But once he got to Chicago, he hooked up with a really hideous communist front group called the American Peace Mobilization. And Congress called it one of the most blatantly notorious, seditious fronts ever to exist in the United States. The Democratic Congress called it that, rightly so. And this was a group, and this will shock people, but when Hitler and Stalin signed a pact in 1939, that meant that American communists suddenly, on a dime, started accommodating Hitler. They became pro-Hitler because now Hitler was Uncle Joe's ally. So this American Peace Mobilization called FDR a warmonger, all kinds of things. They urged that the U.S. stay out of the war, don't stop Hitler. They urged no Lend-Lease money to Britain. They accused Britain of imperialism and aggression as the British were being savagely attacked by the Nazis. And this American Peace Mobilization, I published the document in the appendix of the book. It's a Soviet Comintern document that says this group was organized on our initiative in Chicago in the fall of 1940. And Frank Marshall Davis worked with that group. He helped them organize an anti-war conference. I'm paraphrasing. It's called something like American Negroes and the War, where they urged Black Americans not to go to war, wanted America to stay out of the war, and then even worse, in 1943, I estimate it's 43. It was sometime during the war. Frank Marshall Davis actually joined the party. Now, most people that joined the American Communist Party joined before the Hitler-Stalin Pact. And then they left after the Hitler-Stalin Pact. They were so outraged. Davis actually joined after the Hitler-Stalin Pact. That's pretty remarkable.
That's amazing.
I think that tells you a lot.
It does tell you a lot.
Too, by the way, it doesn't mean that Davis was pro-Hitler. It means that he was such an unwaveringly loyal Soviet patriot that, like all the other American communist folks, he saluted the red flag.
That's really. It's really staggering when you think of the implications of that. Phil asking, as you mentioned with the 22 mentions in the book, that he just refers to him as Frank. And do we know anything about what the motivation there would be? Why was it an attempt to maybe talk about an influence but kind of shroud that a little bit as though it wouldn't be found out? Or was this part of to what extent he was involved? We know that through some of the confirmed books that have been out there, that Bill Ayers had some role in shaping the narrative in Dreams from My Father. Was this intended to be one of those composite figures, or do we really think that Frank is Frank and he was just intentionally shrouded?
Yeah, Frank is Frank. No one has any question about that. David Marinas, David Remnick, everybody agrees. We all know it's Frank Marshall Davis. But he left out the full name, and he cites him as Frank 22 times, and then dozens more via pronouns and other forms of reference, over thousands of pages in every section of the memoir. But there's no index, and he never once gives his full name. And I think that's to help conceal the identity of this very sensitive political figure. And at the same time, you wonder, well, then why didn't he just leave him out altogether? I think because Obama realized that would be disrespecting not only Davis, but the true narrative of his life story. So here again, the fact that he would even mention Frank that many times when he clearly knew about this guy's past shows that, if anything, he probably understated the relationship, adding even more credibility to the fact that this was a pretty decisive mentor.
I'm giving the touche point to Alex, who I just put the question or the point on the screen, saying, we've all been focused on Obama the other day, talking about American business people and saying, if you built something, you didn't build it on your own. You're a product of all of the people that have influenced you. And too bad so many of the ones around Obama were people like Frank Marshall Davis. It really is. If we held Obama to his own words from the other day, then we got a problem.
He couldn't have got there on his own. He had to have gotten there with some help from Frank.
And Tiffany, jump in here at any point. Tiffany, by the way, I should note, you spent a number of years in Chicago too. So even though you're based in New York for the Blaze and happen to be in D.C. today, you've seen firsthand what the product of progressive government and styles and influence has wrought in the city government there in Chicago.
I'm trying to block it out, Scott. Thanks for reminding me. No, really, it is the belly of the beast, and you really see the Chicago politics brought here, brought to D.C. and on the national stage. One of the things that I really was struck by in the book was, Paul's very clear to say, Obama was not a communist. He's not saying that he is. He's saying this is his mentor. Mm-hmm. His mentor was a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. And here are the parallels that you can see now with Obama's policies throughout the Obama administration, whether it's connections to David Axelrod and Valerie Jarrett, whether it was, General Motors, nationalized health care, the terms forward and hope and change. These are not coincidences. These are not accidents. These are some very, very specific instances and very specific kind of, issues that I would say Frank Marshall Davis really took on when he was very active in the Communist Party. Paul, could you speak to that a little bit? I think some of the viewers might be interested.
Yeah, imagine a man whose enemies were Winston Churchill, disliked Winston Churchill. If Frank could have, he would have sent the bust of Winston Churchill right out of the Oval Office, as Barack Obama did. He constantly bashed General Motors, would have targeted General Motors for government action. And why? Because General Motors made too much profits, as Frank Marshall Davis said. He was always blasting Wall Street, big business, big oil, Standard Oil, GOP tax cuts, the wealthy, corporation executives, and on and on. Supported, get this, redistribution of wealth to public works projects as a way to keep America from going into another Great Depression. Supported, as he put it, taxpayer funding of universal health care, was pro-Russia at the expense of countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia. And today, President Obama canceled the missile shield with Poland and the Czech Republic. So the parallels, and I can't say that, well, Obama did these things and believes these things because Frank Marshall Davis also did, and gee, there must have been a moment in, say, February 1978 when Frank told Obama about Churchill and General Motors. But the similarities are strikingly coincidental, and I think they're kind of eerie, actually.
Well, and I'm sure there are a number of radical influences on Obama, and we just, but when you pour all of those into that blender of a person's sort of psyche in their formative years, I think this is what comes out. And I think in any scenario, I think you'd have to say if Frank Marshall Davis were alive today and looking at the Obama presidency, how pleased he would be with much of it, and probably the parts that he wasn't pleased with, he'd be on the phone with Obama telling him to kind of move left and fast. Let me ask you real quick. We only have you for about another 7 minutes. I have promised the Glenn's producers, because you're joining Glenn on the 5 o'clock broadcast as well. So trying to get to some of these questions. Mike asking, that some of this may upset people, and you're digging into a lot of information that people might consider to be disturbing. Are you ever concerned for your own safety?
Well, I hope not, and I hope that's not the case. And I mean, there is some of this information has been out there. Cliff Kincaid and people like that have posted Frank Marshall Davis's FBI file up on the internet, and the fact that file is up there and is ignored by people like David Remnick and others is astonishing. So, but I did find things that no one else has found, such as the Chicago Star columns, the Honolulu Record columns. Got those out of actual university libraries in places like University of Hawaii, Manoa. But no, a lot of this information is already out there. But what's new, Scott, is to pull it all together in a sort of comprehensive biography of the life of Frank Marshall Davis. And by the way,
go ahead.
All Obama really has to say, and all Obama's people really have to say is, okay, so this guy was an influence in his life, but and the guy was a communist, but our guy Obama clearly never joined the Communist Party, and be done with it. But I like to at least see them acknowledge this influence and how Obama, presumably moved away from that sort of fringe far left. I'd like to see them just explain it.
Right, right. And you would think it would just, I don't know what PR strategy is involved there that would say that evading all of this stuff has been a benefit to Obama. Right. I'm going to hit some just rapid fire questions here so we can do maybe quick answers, and that way we'll get to as many of the folks that have been tuning in. And if you're just tuning in, you're watching a Blazecast here live on Wednesday afternoon. Scott Baker, editor-in-chief of the Blaze, with you here from our Pittsburgh studio. Paul Kengor coming from our Dallas office, where he's getting set to go on with Glenn here in the next hour on Blaze TV. Richard asking, we know of Obama writing about Frank. Are there any contemporaneous accounts of anybody else recounting conversations or the influence between the two? Did Frank Marshall Davis ever write anything about the young Obama?
Yeah, Frank Marshall Davis himself, he did not. Frank Marshall Davis's biographer, a woman named Catherine Takara, a University of Hawaii professor, she spent a lot of time with Davis the last 15 years of his life. She talked about how Frank had a profound influence on Obama, including Obama believing in the very notion of change, which of course was the one-word slogan for the whole Obama movement. Stanley Dunham the grandfather would have been there in those meetings between Obama and Frank. Actually, most of the meetings were between Obama and Frank, just the two of them. Stanley Dunham is gone. There is a woman named Donna Weatherly Williams who was quoted by Toby Harnden in the London Telegraph piece, and also by David Remnick in his book. And Donna Weatherly Williams was actually there in 1970 when Dunham introduced Davis and Obama. So she's an eyewitness, and she speaks very strongly of Davis's influence on Obama in very much mentor-like terms. In fact, in terms so strong that I would describe it almost beyond mentorship.
Let me ask you this, Gary. I just put the question up with saying any connections between people like Davis and members of the media, and we addressed earlier that his connections to Vernon Jarrett, Valerie Jarrett's father-in-law, if I'm remembering here, right? But he himself was a very influential journalist.
Yeah, he was a good journalist. I mean, when he wasn't writing pro-Soviet propaganda. In fact, as Tiffany said earlier, I'm quite sympathetic to him. The racial persecution that this man underwent in the 1910s, 1920s was terrible. And anybody listening right now who's harboring ill will towards Frank Marshall Davis is because of some of what I've said. Think about this. Imagine this 5-year-old little boy, Frank, who's nearly lynched as he's walking home from school one day. So I always, no matter what, had this sympathy for him. And I found myself rooting for his success. When he joined the Communist Party, I felt let down. Like, no, you don't want to do this. Come on, look how hard you've worked. You're a self-made man. You're the quintessential example of the American way. Why in the world would you be joining, the side of the Soviet Union? So that was very frustrating to me. I see Frank really in many ways as a victim of this very perverse ideology.
Let me. We have a question on the screen about the Cold War and Obama's sort of statist agenda, and because of the framework, and you were describing Frank Marshall Davis's view of Winston Churchill, of colonialism, all of that. You are a Cold War historian, sort of by trade. Is that a fair connection to say that in some ways, even though time has moved on, that Obama may be sort of stuck in a sliver of history?
Yeah, I do. The way that Obama has been so staunchly pro-Russia at the expense of wonderful allies like Poland in particular, and the Czech Republic, and the canceling of that missile shield, and telling Dmitry Medvedev that he'll have more flexibility after the election. And Medvedev said, well, I'll pass that on to Vladimir Putin. The way he seems buddies with the Russians. And Poles are very, very, very upset with President Obama. I mean, I write for their publications all the time, and so I see that as a commonality, and it's possible that could be maybe attributed to Frank Marshall Davis. And of course, Winston Churchill. I mean, Winston Churchill was arguably the 20th century's greatest anti-communist. He was also pro-colonialism. But it's for those two reasons, both the anti-communism and the pro-colonialism, that Davis couldn't stand Churchill. And I think maybe both of those factors also help explain why Obama so disliked Churchill, that one of the first things he did as president was he sent that bust of Churchill out of the Oval Office.
Stan posting a question here in our last minute or two with you here about could we consider this at all, whether you look at the mentorship of Frank Marshall Davis or other figures, that there was a sense of grooming Obama, maybe not for the presidency, but for some kind of role in public life, that they thought that that at some point, whether it was in his late teen years or early college years, that somehow all of these things sort of came together with maybe a little bit of intention, if not entire foreshadowing.
Well, there in the end of Frank Marshall Davis's memoirs, and I quote it in the book, he has this kind of prophetic statement where he talks about how Black Americans had increasingly inched their way to the Oval Room, as he called it, not the Oval Office, the Oval Room, and how proud he was of that. And at that point, those were memoirs that were written in the 70s. They were published posthumously after his death in 1992. But, you know, to imagine that this young man that Davis influenced would not only have inched his way to the Oval Room, but, you know, has the desk in the Oval Office, you know, I find that kind of moving. And, you know, it's if you put the politics aside, I find that kind of moving. It's just too bad that the politics, and Davis's especially, were so bad.
Well, Paul, I've pushed you 1 minute past the time limit that I promised the GBTV Glenn's producers that we would let you get off to get set for his show. Maybe let's do this again in even a couple of weeks. I'd like to get feedback that you're getting from the book as we go along, and I can't wait to dive into the deep sections of it myself.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Tiffany.